The night air was sharp, carrying the faint, metallic scent of an approaching storm. I left the sterile light of the church basement behind, trading the forced camaraderie of shared suffering for the honest solitude of the street. The sobriety chip felt heavy and absurd in my pocket, a testament not to moral fortitude but to an enhanced capacity for calculated violence. I drove the streets of the neighborhood I had appropriated, the sedan humming softly beneath me, a perfect simulacrum of respectability. The house on Elm Street was the grandest theft of all. It wasn't just a dwelling, it was a museum of Marcus Hawthorne's unlived future, the expensive, neutral furniture, the unread books on tax law, the framed photograph on the mantelpiece of a smiling, dark-haired woman, Marcus's fiancée, who had eventually succumbed to the grief I hadn't owned. I walked through the quiet rooms, running my hand along the polished wood of the banister, a physical act of tracing the parameters of the lie. My preparation wasn't spiritual, it was forensic. I went to the small, mahogany desk in the study, Marcus's favorite spot, according to the fiancée's tearful testimony years ago, and opened a hidden compartment beneath the false bottom. Inside were the last vestiges of Barnaby King. A tarnished silver locket and a single, heavy-gauge hunting knife. I had carried them for 20 years, the knife as an insurance policy, the locket as a miserable memento of the family curse. The curse was a biological flaw, not a demon contract. The King bloodline never shapeshifted by will, it was a catastrophic defense mechanism, a mirroring of the nearest viable human host triggered by mortal trauma. We weren't apex predators, we were glorified, panicked chameleons. That summer night in 2002, when Lillian and I were running from the consequence of our previous, clumsy transformation, we crashed on Blackwood Creek Road. Marcus Hawthorne, driving home late, stopped to help. He was a decent man, too curious for his own good. I remember the impact, the searing pain of my collapsing ribs, the immediate, sickening liquefaction of my cells. I watched in horror as Lillian, my frightened, panicked sister, took the full brunt of the energy expenditure. She dissolved, unstable and weak, clinging desperately to the nearest source of life, Marcus's dying form. But Marcus was already too far gone. In that moment of shared carnage, my own body, in its frantic effort to survive, anchored onto the strongest residual template available. I didn't choose Marcus Hawthorne's face, I was force-fed his dying blueprint. I crawled out of the wreckage wearing the skin of the victim, while Lillian stabilized herself into something less defined, something monstrously incomplete, and fled into the dark. Lillian knew. She saw the change. She saw the profound cowardice of my choice, taking a ready-made life, complete with a sympathetic backstory, instead of facing the terrifying consequences of being truly shapeless. I had stolen his identity and allowed the world to grieve the shell of the man I had replaced. She saw the coward, and she had waited 2 decades for me to sober up enough to matter again. I sat in the darkness of the living room, the hunting knife laid carefully on the coffee table. The fluorescent yellow of the basement was gone, replaced by the deep, unforgiving blackness of a sober night. Sobriety had peeled away the layers of Marcus Hawthorne's borrowed trauma, revealing the true core of Barnaby King beneath, the fear and hunger. I was not waiting for an arrest or a confession. I was waiting for the King bloodline to settle its affairs. The air pressure dropped noticeably, a sudden, heavy silence swallowing the usual distant traffic noise. Then, the sound came. It wasn't a knock or a crash. It was the soft, deliberate turning of a key in the front door lock. The spare key. The one Marcus Hawthorne had given his fiancée 21 years ago. Lillian wasn't kicking down the door. She was walking into the life I had stolen, ready to claim the final price. The inventory was complete. I stood up from the stolen sofa, my borrowed suit fitting tightly over a body that no longer craved alcohol, only resolution. Barnaby King finally stopped running. He ran not with the desperate stride of a hunted creature, but with the clumsy, athletic gait of a kind-hearted young man who had just witnessed something impossible and horrifying. The legs felt wrong. They were Marcus's legs, strong and purposeful, not the jittery, malnourished limbs of Gilroy. Every fiber of the new body resisted the flight, demanding he turn back, demanding he help Chloe, demanding he honor the sacrifice he had just profited from. This was the curse of Marcus Hawthorne's skin, it came bundled with Marcus's conscience. The guilt was a physical weight, heavier than the cold air pressing in from the California redwoods. It wasn't the abstract shame Barnaby usually felt, it was specific, borrowed regret for missed graduation ceremonies, for the quiet fear of failing his parents, for the deep, impossible love Marcus held for a girl named Sarah whom Barnaby had never met. Barnaby was now Marcus, and Marcus was a hero, a concept utterly foreign and violently unwelcome to the creature trapped inside this vessel. He heard the Queen's roar fade behind him, a sound of grief, savage satiation. Lillian was feeding, cementing her own temporary form, preoccupied with extracting the final moments of profound terror from the selfless victim. This distraction was his only advantage. He pushed through the thicket, the pine needles scratching at the expensive, well-fitting shirt that now clung to his chest. Gilroy's clothes had been rough canvas, Marcus's were soft cotton. The difference felt like a fundamental betrayal. The sheer volume of Marcus's memories was debilitating. Barnaby kept stumbling, disoriented not by the physical terrain but by the constant, flashing montage of an entire human life he now owned. He knew Marcus's locker combination, his least favorite professor, the scar on his knee from a bike accident at age 9. This wasn't just a disguise, it was an encyclopedia of genuine human connection, a 9-cage gilded with painful purity. He finally collapsed by a rushing creek, plunging his new face into the icy water. When he looked up, the reflection staring back was undeniably Marcus Hawthorne, open, trustworthy, innocent. The perfect life shield. The perfect trap. Lillian had anticipated this. She hadn't merely wanted him to run, she had engineered the crisis, forcing him to steal the one identity rich enough in commitment to pin him down permanently. Gilroy could vanish, Marcus Hawthorne had roots, a credit score, a future. He could not simply shed this skin and move on without triggering a missing person investigation that would draw her attention like a beacon. He was now tethered. He heard the snap of a branch miles back. Lillian was coming. She wouldn't be running, she would be tracking, savoring the anticipation, allowing the profound psychic link, the unbreakable bond of king and queen, to pull her directly to him. The bond was stronger now, fueled by the violence of the night. He could taste her predatory glee mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood, a sickening echo of his own original hunger. Barnaby, as Marcus, wiped the water from his face. The initial panic began to congeal into a cold, hard resolution, the kind of calculating focus that had defined his monstrous existence before the distraction of alcohol. He couldn't run far, not with this identity, and not with the Queen so close. He had to pivot from flight to concealment, from evasion to operation. He remembered the motel room, the detox, and the purpose of the fourth step, the fearless inventory. The inventory was complete, but it wasn't a list of sins, it was the life of Marcus Hawthorne, a life he had to adopt, live, and ultimately desecrate to survive. Marcus's future was now his penance. If he was to survive the Queen's pursuit, he had to become the image she could not easily track, not the fleeing monster, but the grieving survivor. He rose, shivering, tasting the metallic copper of his own blood mixed with the cold, alien purity of Marcus's life. He needed to get out of Blackwood Creek, find a place where crowds and concrete could obscure the connection. He needed to find Sarah. She would be the key. Marcus loved her deeply, a detail now etched into Barnaby's brain. By approaching her, by assuming Marcus's grief over the massacre at the campsite, he would establish the foundation of his new identity. He would become the tragic figure, the one who escaped, the one the Queen would be looking for in a few days, not the one she expected to find immediately. He began walking toward the road, forcing Marcus's memory of the nearest town to the forefront of his mind. He would carry the stolen skin, the borrowed soul, and the unbearable guilt like armor. He would live the life of Marcus Hawthorne, perpetually waiting for the day the Queen found him again. The king was still in hiding, but now his cage was complete, and the lock was forged from the unbearable, selfless sacrifice of the man whose name he now wore. The metallic taste had finally settled, bitter and absolute, tasting exactly like the regret of a stolen future. The air that struck me on the access road was cool and clean, unlike the ravine's humid rot, but it did nothing to cleanse the filth clinging to me, the blood, the mud, and the crushing weight of a stolen life. I kept running for perhaps another mile before the exhaustion of Marcus Hawthorne's athletic frame was overwhelmed by the injuries inflicted upon Gilroy's body. I collapsed, retching, the sound weak and pitiful in the strong, new throat. I dragged myself up again, forcing my brain to organize the lie. Cowardice is often the most meticulous architect. I didn't stop until I found the lights of a distant farmhouse. I stumbled toward them, practicing the role of a traumatized soul survivor. I had to look like a man who had faced the unfaceable and lost everything, which, ironically, was half true. I had lost Barnaby King, a loss I welcomed, but I was now inextricably fused with the grief of Marcus Hawthorne. The farmer who found me, a heavy-set woman named Martha, recoiled initially from the sight of the blood-soaked, feral youth. "What happened to you, son?" she asked, her voice tight with fear and suspicion. I looked at her, channeling the shock, letting the fear rise naturally. When I spoke, the voice that emerged was Marcus's, deep, gentle, and choked with genuine terror. They took them," I whispered, tasting the metallic tang of the lie. "We were camping. Blackwood Creek. There was something in the woods. Lillian. It took Gilroy. It took Sarah and Thomas." I used the names of the innocent couple, cementing their fate as part of my narrative. I ran. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs. Martha called the state police. The hours that followed were a grueling gauntlet of interrogation, hospitalization, and mandatory counseling. I was Marcus Hawthorne, the victim. My story held together not because I was a good liar, which I was, but because the trauma etched into Marcus's muscles and nerves was real. Every shudder, every lapse into silence, every tear that fell from Marcus's beautiful green eyes was authentic. The memories of his friends, of his parents, of his future, they were all present in this stolen vessel, ready to be accessed and weaponized for survival. The true horror began when I was alone, sitting in the sterile, fluorescent quiet of the hospital room. I looked at the reflection in the window. Marcus Hawthorne, a strong jaw, kind eyes, the sort of face that parents trust. I felt an alien rage surge through me, the sheer injustice that this man had been the one to die. Barnaby King, the rotten seed, had been given the perfect bloom. I closed my eyes and reached inward. I found Marcus's mind, a landscape of decency and ambition. I felt the sharp, immediate love for his parents, the casual familiarity with his home address, his bank pen, the specific shade of blue he favored. It was all there, a fully functioning personality mapped onto my own parasitic core. The King essence had not merely swapped bodies, it had absorbed the host's psychic history like marrow. But the King essence was adapting. When Marcus's mother, Carol, arrived, the performance became agonizingly real. She rushed in, tears streaming, clutching me to her chest. I felt the authentic, visceral relief of her son, Marcus, channeled through my skin. I embraced her back, whispering assurances. In that moment, I was Marcus Hawthorne, grieving his friends and accepting the comfort of his mother. The guilt was suffocating, yet the relief of being free from the King curse was a powerful narcotic. The police searched Blackwood Creek. They found the desolate campsite, the horrific scene, and the mangled remains of Gilroy's body. The body of Gilroy, the vessel Lillian had sought, was identified and linked to a list of known petty criminals. No one mourned Gilroy. The narrative was complete. A noble young man, Marcus Hawthorne, had barely escaped a brutal assault that claimed the lives of his friends and the unknown wanderer. Lillian had confirmed the lie herself. She had taken the only thing she truly sought, the physical container of Barnaby King. Weeks passed. I recovered quickly, Marcus's vitality overriding the injuries. I moved into the Hawthorne house, navigating a life I had stolen, speaking words that were not mine, but felt utterly natural. I found myself instinctively reaching for Marcus's favorite coffee mug, laughing at jokes Marcus's father made, and walking with Marcus's confident stride. But the essence, my dark inheritance, was subtle. It did not go away, it merely hid. One night, lying in the unfamiliar comfort of Marcus's bed, I stared at the ceiling. I felt the creeping sense of vigilance that had defined the King line for centuries. It was not paranoia, it was instinct. I got up, moving silently to the window, scanning the moonlit trees bordering the yard. The curse was not gone. It was merely dormant, concealed by the purity of the host. I stepped into the bathroom and looked into the mirror one last time before sleep. Marcus Hawthorne stared back, his expression haunted but resolute. Then, in the faintest shift of the light, I saw it, a momentary flicker in the green of his eyes, a glint of the same phosphorescent yellow that had burned in Lillian's gaze, a color that did not belong to Marcus Hawthorne. Barnaby King was alive. He was safe. But he was no longer just Barnaby King. He was a perfect composite, a king cloaked in the skin of a hero, awaiting the day his true nature would burn through the disguise. I touched the reflection, the glass cool beneath my fingers. I was Marcus now, and the chaos I had fled was merely waiting for me to grow comfortable. The greatest trick the king essence ever pulled was convincing the world it belonged in this body. I was ready to live the lie. I had to be. I was a survivor, and survivors, above all else, adapt. The world after Blackwood Creek was not the howling wilderness Barnaby expected, but the muffled, suffocating quiet of suburbia. He had returned to the Hawthorne house, not as a victorious survivor, but as a stolen artifact, a creature draped in the borrowed skin of a martyr. His first fear, that the disguise would fail, that the mother or father would see the king staring out of Marcus's eyes, proved unfounded. Trauma, Barnaby quickly learned, was the perfect solvent for skepticism. Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne were not looking for flaws, they were looking for affirmation. They saw the blood, the sunken posture, the thousand-yard stare that Marcus now wore, and they categorized it instantly, a survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress. They were too busy thanking God for the return of a son to notice that the soul inside was not the one they had sent away. Barnaby entered Marcus's life like a ghost entering a highly detailed costume drama. He had to learn the cues, the slight flinch when the microwave beeped, the way Marcus held his coffee mug, the nostalgic fondness for the cheap, wooden bookshelf in his old bedroom. Every detail was a potential tripwire, forcing the king, who had lived a life of brutal, shifting instinct, into the rigid mold of conventional human suffering. The physical transformation had been complete, irreversible, but the psychological absorption was agonizingly slow. The body remembered what the mind of the king did not. Marcus's skin held memories, the warmth of his mother's hug, the precise location of the scar from a childhood bicycle accident, the hollow ache in his chest for his true self. Barnaby had stolen the body, but the body was already saturated with the gentle, decent ghost of the man who had owned it. This was the unspeakable guilt. Barnaby King, the ultimate self-serving hedonist, was forced to live the consequences of another man's ultimate act of selfless heroism. Marcus Hawthorne had died to save Barnaby, believing he was saving a friend, only to have his life, his identity, and his future devoured by the very thing he sought to protect. The true horror wasn't the past, it was the present maintenance of the lie. Barnaby had to mourn the death of Gilroy, the other identity he had consumed, and the deaths of the other campers, all while knowing that the person mourning was supposed to be the victim of the rampage. He was the arsonist demanding applause for saving a match from the inferno he started. He lived in constant fear of two things, a discovery by the Hawthorns, and discovery by Lillian. Lillian, or Caleb, or whatever shape the king thing had taken, was the only entity that could truly smell the difference, the only one who knew the precise geometry of Barnaby's soul. Blackwood Creek had been a terrible exchange, a bloody stalemate. Lillian had vanished, wounded, and driven mad, but she was not dead. Barnaby knew, with chilling certainty, that she was hunting. And she would follow the scent of the purest victim, because Barnaby was now draped in the scent of Marcus, the sacrificial lamb. To protect himself, he had to become dull, withdrawn, and terminally depressed, a perfectly believable outcome for a trauma survivor. He retreated into the basement office, a space Marcus had intended for future novel writing, now turned into Barnaby's bunker. He avoided mirrors, not out of vanity, but because looking at Marcus's face felt like blasphemy. The necessity of suppressing the king's nature became the defining axis of his borrowed life. The king was a mutable, hungry thing, thriving on change and consumption. Marcus Hawthorne's life was stasis, silence, and routine. If Barnaby allowed the king to stir, the shifts would begin, a telltale flicker in the eyes, a slight elongation of the fingers, a subtle alteration in the bone structure that no human eye should notice, but which Lillian would recognize immediately. He needed a chemical suppressant. He found it in alcohol. The 2002 Pinot Noir became his sacrament and his shield. It wasn't just self-medication for the terror, it was a psychological and biological tool of survival. First, the alcohol blunted the internal radar of the king. It coated the instincts, slowed the metabolism, and prevented the involuntary, subtle shape-shifting that was the king's default state. A drunken king was a sluggish king, less likely to hunt, less likely to revert, and far less dangerous to his own disguise. Second, it was the social lubricant of the lie. A high-functioning alcoholic was exactly what Marcus Hawthorne, the traumatized survivor, was expected to become. It explained the isolation, the slurred words, and the refusal to engage in recovery or therapy. "I'm just coping," he would tell Mrs. Hawthorne, echoing the script Marcus would have used. But the most insidious function of the wine was that it anesthetized him to the haunting echoes of Marcus Hawthorne. When Barnaby was sober, the guilt felt like a fever. He could almost hear Marcus's genuine voice of decency, whispering criticisms from inside his own head. When drunk, the borrowed pain was muffled, the edges of the truth softened. The wine allowed him to compartmentalize. Marcus's life was the cage, the king was the prisoner, and the alcohol was the sedative that kept the prisoner compliant. Barnaby was perpetually trapped between two forms of suffering. If he was sober, the king would begin to chafe, demanding release, threatening to tear Marcus's beautiful disguise apart. If he was drunk, he was safe from the change, but he was drowning in the nauseating moral weight of the borrowed life. Years passed in this suffocating isolation. He became a master of the mundane, perfecting the art of being invisible. He took a remote job, designing technical schematics, a career Marcus had dabbled in, which required minimal human interaction. He spoke only in short, clipped sentences, maintaining the persona of the deeply wounded man. He realized the Hawthorns loved him blindly, unconditionally. This love was not a source of comfort, it was a continuous indictment. Every gentle touch from Marcus's mother, every attempt by Marcus's father to engage in some lost, shared memory, was a thrust of the knife. He was accepting comfort he had not earned, stealing love intended for a better man. The king had always been a parasite, but this was the deepest, most complex parasitism yet. He wasn't just draining vitality, he was draining love, hope, and peace from an innocent family. His days were marked by the sun sinking and the uncorking of the bottle. His nights were spent staring at the ceiling, analyzing every creak in the house, every distant siren, convinced it was Lillian, returning to reclaim the body she thought she had mutilated, only to find it already occupied. He was a king living like a pauper, chained by the very prize he had stolen. The escape plan from Blackwood Creek had worked flawlessly, but the subsequent decades were spent in a self-made prison of deceit, alcohol, and terror. And then came the moment of clarity, the accidental sobriety forced upon him by a severe withdrawal that landed him shaking and vomiting in Marcus's clean, sterile bathroom. The alcohol was failing. It was no longer a suppressant, it was simply a poison, dulling his senses too much, making him vulnerable to the approaching threat he could sense but not pinpoint. In the shattering lucidity of forced sobriety, Barnaby saw the situation clearly. He was not surviving, he was waiting to be caught. And when Lillian came, she wouldn't just take him, she would destroy the Hawthorns, the only true innocents left in this twisted drama, simply to inflict maximum pain on the king who stole her vengeance. The lie of Marcus Hawthorne had to end. And for the first time in his life, Barnaby King felt a sickening urge toward an action that was utterly selfless, an act not of instinct or survival, but of genuine, if deeply cynical, atonement. He had to sober up, not to save himself, but to save the family whose son he had stolen. He had to trade Marcus's life back for something clean, a final, definitive death for both Barnaby King and Lillian. The true, difficult fourth step, the fearless moral inventory, could only be completed with one final, deliberate act, a responsibility for his own annihilation. He dumped the remaining 2002 Pinot down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl away, severing the chemical anchor that had kept him tethered to Marcus's miserable existence. The king was awake now, angry, and cold sober. And he knew exactly where Lillian would be hiding. The white light intensified, swallowing the shadows of the quarry hole. It was not fire, but pure, concentrated energy, the king's desperate, distilled life force. Lillian's perfect armor cracked instantly, spiderwebbing across her chest as the psychic feedback overwhelmed her. She shrieked, a sound of pure violated power, but her grip on Barnaby was locked by the lethal magnetism of the blast. The stolen memories, the years of power, the accumulated essence of the Queen, all was simultaneously compressed and ripped apart. The ground beneath them convulsed, the granite groaning under the strain. Barnaby felt the agony as the energy tore Marcus's body apart, bone and sinew vaporizing into raw light. But beneath the pain was a terrifying, profound silence. The high-pitched scream of guilt stopped. The low, hungry hum of the king inside him died. In that final millisecond, as the world turned incandescent white, he wasn't Marcus, and he wasn't the king. He was just Barnaby, a tired man finally paying his tab, offering the entirety of his existence as a down payment for grace. Then, silence. Not a peaceful quiet, but the deafening absence of sound left by an impossible force. The light vanished. Where the entities had stood, there was now a crater of blackened, fused granite, smelling sharply of sulfur and ozone. The queen was gone, utterly annihilated, reduced to nothing more than a faint wisp of dark ash carried away by the sudden, cooling wind. Barnaby's sacrifice had been absolute. All that remained of Marcus's strong, borrowed shell was the ragged, blood-soaked collar of his shirt, snagged on a shard of rock 20 feet from the blast center. The king and the queen, the whole terrible lineage of stolen power, had been rendered inert. The curse was broken. The memory of Marcus's parents flashed in his dissipating consciousness, the quiet, protective sadness in their eyes. Barnaby realized that by destroying the vessel completely, he had sealed the perfect lie. A Marcus Hawthorne had died a heroic death years ago, and now the man who had worn his face had paid the final, necessary price. Barnaby King, the escape artist, had finally ensured that his last act was to offer a truly clean, unburdened memory. There were no remains to identify, no confession to find. Just an empty pickup truck, miles from anywhere, and the final, enduring stillness of the woods. The debt was paid. The fluorescent light in the church basement flickered, turning the cheap coffee lukewarm and the faces of the addicts gray. Barnaby King, currently residing in the skin of Marcus Hawthorne, stared at the spiral notebook in his lap. The task was simple, laid out by step 4 of the 12 steps, * made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. *. Barnaby had been stuck on this step for 6 months. The irony was a bitter, metallic taste, worse than the lingering memory of cheap scotch. How could a creature like him, a shapeshifter, a parasite, a fragment of a primal, monstrous lineage known only as the king, take a moral inventory? His existence was the crime. His life was a lie stapled onto a tragedy. He scribbled a list, trying to adhere to the rigid format required, resentments. Fears. Harms done. Resentment, a Lillian King, for not letting me die in the ditch. Fear, as sobriety. The clarity allows them to see me. Harm done, I stole a man's life, his future, and his very body. But even these felt borrowed. The true resentment belonged to the real Marcus Hawthorne, the brave, doomed kid whose trauma Barnaby wore like a bespoke suit. The fear belonged to the parents who believed their son was just suffering from PTSD. The harm was an astronomical debt that could not be paid in apologies or reparations, it required obliteration. Barnaby, he muttered under his breath, testing the sound of his real name, a name he hadn't spoken since the blood-drenched summer of 2002. It tasted like ash and cheap theater. The monster in him, the king thing that needed to consume and shift to survive, had been docile lately, anesthetized by years of the 2002 poison, that vast ocean of alcohol he had drowned himself in. He had sought the drink not for pleasure, but for silence. It muted the residual consciousness of the true Marcus, whose memories often leaked through, sharp and pure, causing agonizing phantom guilt. It also dulled the king instinct, the predatory hum that reminded him he was still starving. Sobriety had arrived not as a choice for redemption, but as a strategic necessity. The king line was drawn to suffering, and after nearly 2 decades, Lillian, his monstrous sister, the one who had started this curse, was moving. Barnaby could feel her presence shifting, an approaching dread he hadn't felt since the creek. He needed his senses sharp. If he was going to die, he wouldn't die drunk and confused in a borrowed body. "Okay, Barnaby," said Father Thomas, pulling Barnaby's attention back to the circle. "Share what you found. What's the central defect of character?" Barnaby closed the notebook. He knew the answer. It wasn't lust, greed, or pride. It was far simpler. "Cowardice," he said, his voice, Marcus's voice, steady and deep. "My central defect is an absolute, pathological cowardice. Everything I've done, the running, the hiding, the drinking, it's all rooted in the absolute refusal to face the consequences of being what I am." Father Thomas nodded sagely. "And how do we face that fearlessly, son?" Barnaby met his gaze, the monster beneath Marcus's placid features stirring slightly. We stop running. We go back to the source. The moral inventory isn't complete until the debt is paid to the person whose life I stole, and to the person who set me free to steal it. The source was Blackwood Creek. The debt was Lillian. And the ultimate consequence was the end of the king line, even if that line ran through his own veins. This step 4 required not just inventory, but liquidation. He had to be sober to kill her, and perhaps more importantly, to finally kill himself. He stood, nodding farewell to the group. He had 2 weeks before the king sense told him Lillian would be close enough to strike. 2 weeks to prepare the final, truly fearless inventory, of the bullet he would place behind her ear, and the one he would reserve for the borrowed skull of Marcus Hawthorne. The smell of pine sap and damp earth was a trigger, instantly pulling Barnaby back to the summer of 2002. He wasn't the scarred, heavy-shouldered Marcus Hawthorne then. He was Gilroy, a skinny, forgettable transient who had shapeshifted into that identity 6 months prior, a petty criminal who dealt small doses of fear and lived on the fringes. Gilroy had joined a group of college kids at Blackwood Creek purely by chance, drawn by the promise of cheap beer and easy identities if needed. They were young, vibrant, and ripe for the kind of subtle manipulation the king required. Marcus Hawthorne, the real Marcus, was the group's centerpiece, a solid, kind, annoyingly heroic, with a laugh that echoed through the forest. Lillian King, Barnaby's estranged sister, was also there, using the name Caleb. She had chosen the body of a girl barely older than 16, a slight, pale thing with eyes too deep and cold for her age. Lillian, or rather the entity that rode her, was always drawn to innocence, twisting it until it snapped. They sat around a raging fire, the shadows dancing on the tents pitched near the stagnant creek. Tell the king's story again, Caleb, one of the girls slurred, passing a whiskey flask. Lillian, Caleb, smiled, a slow, predatory stretching of the lips that always sent a shiver down Barnaby's spine, even though he shared her monstrous blood. It's not a story for sleeping, Lillian warned, her voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to absorb the light. She began the legend of the kings of the Blackwood. Not the king Barnaby was, a deluded, cowardly parasite, but the true, ancient power. They say the kings of this land were not men, but concepts. They needed to feed not on flesh, but on identity. The old king, hundreds of years ago, feared death. So he found a way to shed his skin. He would hold a ceremony of transference with his most trusted subject. The king would slip into the subject, and the subject's spirit would be crushed, leaving only a husk that was then devoured. Barnaby, Gilroy, watched her, gripping his beer can until the aluminum crimped. The king's tale was their family history, disguised as folklore. The shape-shifting wasn't magic, it was a form of spiritual vampirism. They didn't assume the shape, they consumed the soul and wore the empty skin. But the king grew paranoid, Lillian continued, her eyes locking briefly onto Barnaby's. He started shifting constantly, fearing the moment he settled into a body, that body would betray him. He became a series of lies, a blur of faces. He was never present. He was always running from the last identity he stole. She paused, taking a long drink of air, savoring the silence. And what happens to a king who runs? He becomes weak. He loses his strength. He becomes a coward, Marcus finished, his face etched with sympathy for the fictional character. He was afraid of himself. Exactly, Lillian hissed, the smile returning. He tried to run from his final, great sin, the murder of his own heir. They say the ghost of that heir, consumed but not destroyed, follows the king through every form, waiting for the moment the king is weakest to reclaim his throne. Barnaby's palms were slick. He knew Lillian wasn't talking about an ancient ghost. She was talking about Caleb, the original inhabitant of her body, and about the residual identity of every poor soul he, Barnaby, had ever worn. He was a mosaic of forgotten men, glued together by fear. He glanced around the fire. Marcus was distracted, tending to the flickering flames. He was strong, charismatic, and utterly convinced he could solve any problem with effort and honesty. He was everything Barnaby was not. And he was marked. Barnaby knew what Lillian was doing. She was setting the stage, identifying the targets, and delivering a personal warning to her brother, "Stop running, or I will devour your next disguise." The true moment of terror wasn't Lillian's gruesome story, but the realization that his sister, the apex predator of their line, was right. He was the king who ran. He had been running for 20 years. And tonight, the running would end, either by his own cowardly hand or Lillian's terrifying consumption. The night felt thick, suffocating, soaked in pine and the promise of impending blood. The attack was swift and brutally efficient, a sudden explosion of sound that tore through the comfortable camp silence. It wasn't a spectral attack or a dramatic display of power, it was pure, vicious murder. Lillian, shedding the last vestiges of Caleb's innocence, moved like a striking viper. The first victim was skewered before he could scream, his throat opened with a sickening wet sound. Barnaby, in Gilroy's body, didn't hesitate. He reacted as he always did, a pure, reflexive panic. He scrambled backward, knocking over a tent pole, his mind already calculating the nearest escape route. Survival was the only mantra the King lineage truly knew. Marcus, however, sprinted towards the danger. "Lillian, stop!" Marcus yelled, charging toward the figure drenched in shadow and fresh blood. He grabbed a heavy branch, his instinct to protect overriding any sense of self-preservation. Barnaby saw his chance. While Lillian was occupied with the true hero, he could slip away into the dense woods. He scrambled over the root-tangled earth, the rough bark tearing at Gilroy's thin clothes. He heard the struggle behind him, a sickening mix of choked cries, tearing sounds, and Marcus's strained efforts. Then, a roar, not human, but the sound of something ancient and hungry. Lillian's full, monstrous form was briefly illuminated by the dying campfire, impossibly long limbs, teeth too sharp, eyes glowing with supernatural hunger. Barnaby was running blindly downhill when he slammed into something large and heavy. It was Marcus, who had been thrown, a deep, ragged gash across his chest. The two bodies tumbled down the steep, rocky embankment, a chaotic mess of limbs and accelerating momentum. They landed with bone-jarring impact at the bottom, near the edge of the stagnant creek. Barnaby, momentarily stunned, tasted copper and mud. His vision swam. He was pinned beneath Marcus. The warm, thick blood pouring from Marcus's chest wound soaked into the front of Gilroy's shirt, mixing with the smaller cuts Barnaby had sustained in the fall. It was too much blood, too close, too quick. The King mechanism required proximity, trauma, and the ingestion or deep mixing of the target's fluids, a grotesque spiritual ingestion. The violence of the fall, the shared trauma, and the sheer volume of Marcus's life force flooding Gilroy's skin acted like a catalyst. Barnaby felt the shift happen not as a conscious transformation, but as a violent, internal expulsion. A searing, agonizing ache ran through his bones as the residual soul of Gilroy was ejected and the essence of Marcus Hawthorne was violently pulled in. He gasped, a deep, rattling breath that wasn't Gilroy's, but was somehow stronger, clearer, the breath of a man who had never smoked or hidden. When Barnaby opened his eyes, he saw his hands. They were thicker, cleaner, and unmarked by the cheap tattoos Gilroy had collected. He looked down at the man lying half on him, and a wave of pure horror hit him. The face staring up at him, pale and slick with gore, was Gilroy's face. But the eyes, wide, terrified, yet intensely focused, were the eyes of Marcus Hawthorne. The true Marcus, trapped and dying in the stolen, broken shell of Gilroy. "Barnaby," Marcus whispered, the sound distorted by Gilroy's thin lips. He used Barnaby's true name, instantly recognizing the shift. "She's coming. Run. Tell them I love them." Marcus was sacrificing his final moments, not to save himself, but to protect the pathetic coward who had just stolen his identity. A heavy shadow fell over the creek bed. Lillian and Caleb had followed the blood trail. Barnaby, now Marcus, felt a surge of adrenaline powered by the true Marcus's strength. He rolled away, crawling backward in the new, unfamiliar skin. Lillian surveyed the scene, the two bodies, one clearly dead, the girl whose life she had just consumed, and the two struggling near the creek. She saw the familiar scent of her brother's fear, but now it emanated from the muscular body of the boy who had just fought her. She smiled, a truly terrifying, satisfied expression. "You've chosen a strong vessel, brother. A shame you had to be a hero to get it." Before she could move toward them, the true Marcus, in Gilroy's body, summoning a final, superhuman burst of will, grabbed a rock and slammed it into the nearby ground, splashing blood and mud everywhere, diverting Lillian's attention for a crucial half-second. "Go!" Marcus screamed, his voice strained. Barnaby, the ultimate coward, obeyed. He fled, leaving the man who was dying a second death, the death of his body after the death of his identity, to face the monster alone. He ran up the embankment in Marcus Hawthorne's strong legs, away from the sounds of Lillian tearing her prey apart, and into the dark, terrifying future of a stolen life. Barnaby arrived back in civilization 3 days later, battered, starved, and wearing the clothes of Marcus Hawthorne, a traumatized survivor of a massacre. The acceptance was the worst part. Marcus's parents, the Hawthornes, a kind, sturdy, middle-class couple, were consumed by grief and relief. They saw the vacant stare, the trembling hands, and the sudden aversion to light, and they didn't see Barnaby King, the parasite. They saw their son, Marcus, broken by unspeakable horror. They didn't question the shift in his mannerisms, the subtle loss of his old jokes, or the way his eyes seemed to constantly search the room for an invisible threat. Trauma explained everything. Living in Marcus's skin was a relentless psychological torture. Barnaby had stolen lives before, Gilroy was a cipher, an empty suit. But Marcus Hawthorne was a monumental personality, a moral anchor. Barnaby had to learn to mimic a good man's grief. He had to listen to Mrs. Hawthorne weep as she told him, "You're so brave, son. You survived." He had to nod when Mr. Hawthorne spoke of the senseless tragedy, describing the heroism of the real Marcus in the articles they read. The inherent conflict was crippling, but the king instinct demanded he remain ruthless and ready to flee, while Marcus's memories of love, obligation, and fierce loyalty, demanded he stay and comfort these grieving people. Barnaby became an actor in the most demanding role of his life, a victim. He had to embody the trauma he hadn't experienced, while suppressing the monstrous nature that had allowed him to survive. He was a predator forced to wear the wool of the lamb he'd just consumed. The first few years were a tightrope walk of fear. He constantly searched for Lillian, convinced she would finish the job or, worse, expose him to the Hawthornes. But Lillian, like Barnaby, was a master of evasion, slipping into a new identity far away. The alcohol quickly became his solution. It was a perfect anesthetic. When Barnaby was drunk, the residual consciousness of Marcus, the nagging voice of pure, unearned guilt, was silenced. More importantly, the king's hunger for consumption was dulled. Drinking suppressed the shape-shifting urges. He was terrified that if he got too comfortable or too hungry, he might accidentally shed Marcus's skin and reveal the pathetic, true Barnaby King underneath, shattering the Hawthorne's fragile peace. He adopted Marcus's life, but he made it small. He became a recluse, working from home, avoiding social gatherings, always claiming flashbacks as his excuse. He was trapped in a gilded cage of Marcus's past choices. He maintained Marcus's friendships and hobbies just enough to sustain the lie, all while the real Marcus's soul, a ghost of courage and decency, screamed silently from the depths of Barnaby's consciousness. Every drink was an apology to the true Marcus. Asterisk, I'm sorry I stole your life, but look, I'm making it miserable. I'm destroying the shell you gave me. Asterisk. He lived for nearly 2 decades, a king crippled by borrowed remorse, waiting for the day Lillian would finally find him. He knew that the only truly selfless thing he could do for Marcus Hawthorne was to preserve his legacy and die before Lillian could desecrate it. The decision to quit drinking had been the first truly autonomous act Barnaby King had performed in 20 years. Sobriety cleared the fog, lifting the suppression on the king sense, the grotesque, primal network shared by the king lineage. He could feel Lillian clearly now, as she was near Denver, unstable, feeding poorly, and dangerously close to snapping her current vessel. Barnaby knew his time was up. The moral inventory was complete, the list had devolved into one terrifying certainty: he had to end the lie. If Lillian found Marcus Hawthorne's family, the king curse would consume them all. He spent his final sober week meticulously preparing. He cashed out all of Marcus's assets, ensuring the maximum amount was transferred to the Hawthornes with untraceable legal precision. He wrote a note, not an apology, but a clinical account, disguised as a heavily traumatized final confession, ensuring the focus was on the external monster, Lillian, and not the internal one, Barnaby. He drove Marcus's old truck toward the Kingsense Beacon, deep into the Colorado foothills. He carried a heavy caliber pistol and the grim understanding that he was bringing a knife to a nuclear war. He found her in an abandoned hunting cabin, a place thick with the scent of fear and something far older. Lillian was no longer the slight girl Caleb had inhabited. She was transitioning again, midway through a violent shift. Her body was monstrously elongated, the skin stretched thin, the joints cracking with unnatural size. Caleb, the entity controlling her, had finally broken the vessel completely. Barnaby, the creature rasped, the sound-alert chorus of Lillian's youthful voice and Caleb's ancient snarl. I knew the smell of cowardice would lead me to you eventually. And look at your throne. The handsome hero. Did you enjoy his life? Barnaby, standing tall in Marcus's body, felt a strange, detached calm. He was still the coward, but this time, the fear was channeled into action. It was a heavy mantle, Lillian, he replied, his voice firm. But Marcus was a better man than I could ever pretend to be. I am here to fulfill his legacy, protecting the innocent. Lillian laughed, a horrific, clicking sound. Innocence? We are kings, Barnaby. We are the purest form of necessity. You tried to run from the family, but the curse always demands payment. The curse ends with me, Barnaby stated, raising the pistol. I drank so long to dull your noise, to dull the hunger. But sobriety taught me one thing, I am not Marcus. But I have the strength he gave me. He was not fighting to defeat her, but to sever the king line, to destroy the shared essence that allowed them to jump bodies. To kill Lillian, he had to destroy the part of the king in himself, the part that was tethered to her. You can't kill me without killing yourself, brother, Lillian taunted, moving with terrifying speed, her claws extended. Good, Barnaby said, firing the first round into her shoulder, a shot that barely slowed her descent. The ensuing conflict was not a fight, but an execution ritual. Barnaby, fueled by Marcus's physical tenacity and the sheer, desperate willpower of a man finally choosing to die honorably, held the line. He dodged the razor-sharp strikes, the pistol shots echoing uselessly off the hardened bone of her revolving form. He allowed her to grab him, wrapping her hideous limbs around Marcus's torso, preparing for the final, gruesome consumption. The proximity of the king blood was immediate and overwhelming. Barnaby felt the primal draw, the urge to shift, to consume Lillian and take her power, becoming the apex king. But he resisted. For the first time, Barnaby King held onto the trauma, the borrowed guilt, and the profound love the true Marcus had shown him. Instead of fighting, he plunged the barrel of the gun deep into the soft, transitioning flesh of her neck, ignoring the pain of her claws digging into his own chest. This is my inventory, Barnaby snarled, his eyes blazing with a courage that was truly foreign to him. The final entry, the king is liquidated. He pulled the trigger. The detonation in Lillian's neck was catastrophic, not just physically, but metaphysically. It was a direct, explosive trauma to the center of the king's shared consciousness, the core source of their shifting power. A blinding, greenish-black ichor sprayed outwards, scalding the air and sizzling against the cabin's timber walls. Lillian released Barnaby, staggering backward with a choked, inhuman shriek that ripped through the forest silence. Her body began to convulse, retracting, inflating, caught in an uncontrollable, agonizing loop of transformation. Barnaby, Marcus, stumbled away, the stolen body already failing. Lillian's claws had raked deep, and the ichor was burning his skin. But the true damage was internal. The blast had ricocheted through the king's sense, shattering the psychic connections, and tearing at the edges of Barnaby's own soul. He collapsed against a filthy countertop, watching the terrifying spectacle. Lillian was dissolving, her physical form tearing apart as the entity, Caleb, tried desperately to find a new, viable vessel. But the connection was broken. Barnaby had created an emotional and physical void too vast to cross. As the king essence was violently ripped from Lillian's body, Barnaby felt a corresponding tear within himself. He hadn't just killed his sister, he had executed the part of him that allowed him to be anything but Barnaby King. The pain was immense, the sensation of his very being unraveling, the accumulated identities of 20 years screaming in a final, dying chorus. He could hear Gilroy's pathetic whimper, the previous identity's silent cries, and beneath them all, the pure, strong, steady heartbeat of Marcus Hawthorne. In the midst of the chaos and the escalating pain, Marcus's spirit finally asserted itself, not as an antagonist, but as a deliverer. Barnaby felt Marcus's memories, the warmth of his family, the taste of his mother's cooking, the genuine commitment to honesty, flood his consciousness, not as haunting reminders, but as a final, protective embrace. Barnaby looked down at the pistol, now slick with his own blood. The final, crucial step of the moral inventory was still unfinished. He reached for the weapon, his hand trembling. He had paid the debt to Lillian, now he had to pay the debt to Marcus Hawthorne. He couldn't leave this stolen body, this vessel of courage and decency, to be found and examined, contaminating Marcus's noble sacrifice at Blackwood Creek. He put the cold muzzle against his temple. The shapeshifter's death was always murky. If he died, would Marcus be freed? Or would they both simply cease to exist? He didn't know, and for the first time, he didn't care about the outcome for Barnaby King. He only cared about the purity of the final act. Fearless moral inventory. Barnaby saw his life flash before him, not as a montage of successful disguises, but as a list of his actions as Marcus Hawthorne. He had stopped the drinking. He had secured the family's future. He had faced the source of the evil. This final moment was the one thing he hadn't stolen. It was his. He closed his eyes. The chaos of Lillian's final, grotesque dissolution was fading. The internal screaming was quieting. All that remained was the quiet, profound awareness of the body he wore, a body that had protected the weak and died a hero's death twice. He pulled the trigger. The sound was sharp, abrupt, and final. It was followed, not by darkness, but by silence. In the ensuing quiet, no new identity emerged. No spirit fled. No monster survived.